Do you foresee the relationship between China and Russia as one of subordination or one of equal footing? And how would that impact, the people of Southeast Asia and other parts of the world?
I think there's no question that American policy toward China and American policy toward Russia has pushed them closely together.
Yeah.
I think that there's no question that the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Russia does not lose in Ukraine. So if at any point it appears the Russians are losing, I think you can rest assured the Chinese will do everything they can to make sure the Russians don't lose. I would not describe it. I would describe the situation as one where I think the United States has created a situation where there's a lot of interdependence between China and Russia. It's not so much that Russia is subordinated to China. It's that Russia is dependent on China. And in a very important way, China is dependent on Russia. That's why I say the Chinese cannot afford to allow the Russians to lose. So you have this interdependence between them. And it's somewhat asymmetrical. I think that's what you're getting at, that I think the Russians are more dependent on the Chinese than the Chinese on the Russians.
Yeah.
But I don't think subordination is the word I would use. I think, dependence going both ways is what is driving
asymmetric dependence.
Yeah, I think asymmetric dependence would be a good way to put it. Now, I think what this means is that the war in Ukraine is likely to go on for a long, long time. It's likely to go on because the Russians and the Ukrainians, leave the Chinese out, the Russians and the Ukrainians don't have a common set of objectives that would allow them to reach an agreement.
Yeah.
They're never going to agree on how to divide the territory in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're never going to agree on whether Ukraine is a neutral state or a member of the West. So I think the best you can hope for, just focusing on Ukraine and Russia, is a cold peace, right? That you'll get you'll get a ceasefire at some point, and you'll get a cold peace. It'll look like the 38th parallel in Korea, but you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. Then when you factor in the Chinese, one could argue the Chinese have a vested interest in this war going on and on and on. Because as long as the war continues and the United States is pinned down in Europe, the United States is limited in its ability to focus on East Asia. What the United States should be doing at this point in time is fostering good relations with the Russians and pivoting full force to East Asia, because China is a peer competitor. Russia is not. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers.
Right.
So the United States should be, number one, forming some sort of close relationship with Russia, and number two, pivoting full force to East Asia. Is it doing that? No. It's actually pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and it's pinned down in Eastern Europe. That is good news for the Chinese. The Chinese are the winners so far in this war. But this tells you that from China's point of view, it's not such a bad thing if the war in Ukraine continues for the foreseeable future. Countries in East Asia, this again includes Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, to include Australia. Well, all these countries should be nervous about what the Americans are doing. I believe that if things change with regard to Ukraine, it will not be because of American politics. I think it will be because of events involving those two wars. It will be a consequence of changes in the international system. The fact is that the American foreign policy elite is actually quite homogeneous in its views on what American policy should be. The argument that the Republicans and the Democrats think about foreign policy in different ways is not true. This is Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It's very important to understand that both President Obama and President Trump got elected on a platform that said they were going to fundamentally change American foreign policy. In both cases, the so-called blob, the foreign policy establishment, defeated them. Remember, Trump was committed to improving relations with Putin, right? He was interested in getting out of Europe and putting an end to NATO and so forth and so on. None of that happened. And the reason is the blob, the foreign policy establishment, is so powerful. So even if Trump gets reelected in 2024, he's not going to be able to change things very much at all. American policy is set in stone at this point. And of course, Obama admitted in an exit interview he gave to the Atlantic magazine in 2000, I believe it was 2009, as he was leaving the White House, that the blob had defeated him. And so I don't think that domestic politics will matter. I might be wrong. Going back to your description of the economic consequences of these various policies and how the United States spends like a drunken sailor, it may lead to a situation where there is domestic unrest. I think, by the way, just to add one point to this, I think where you're likely to see domestic unrest matter is in Europe. It's more likely.
Yeah.
Less likely in the United States.
Yeah. But you see things moving more to the right, over time in Europe?
Yeah. I just see a lot more dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And one could argue that people on the left, that represent workers, will be as dissatisfied as the populist right.
Right.
So you could see, widespread support for changing our policy. You want to think about what the consequences will be if the Ukrainians lose. And I think a very good case can be made that the Ukrainian forces will be battered, badly damaged, if they launch an offensive. And this will present a huge crisis for Ukraine. But what that will tell your average citizen in the West is that all of this support has been futile. And if anything, this is just going to go on and on forever and ever. Many people describe this Ukrainian army that's now facing the Russians as the third Ukrainian army that we've helped to build. Well, what if this third Ukrainian army is defeated? Are we going to build a fourth Ukrainian army, a fifth Ukrainian army? Are you going to spend all those dollars or euros on bankrolling the Ukrainians when you have Americans and Europeans who are paying electricity bills that they can't afford, and so forth and so on? So it may be the case that domestic politics matters a lot more than I said before.
This is my last question. You're very popular in China, right? Is that because they think your theory is right, or because they know people are not listening to your theory?
It's an interesting question. I started going to China in the very early 2000s when the tragedy of Great Power Politics was first published.
Right.
And it was translated shortly thereafter into Chinese. And in that book, of course, I argued that China could not rise peacefully.
Yeah.
And I was actually surprised that the Chinese invited me. And then when I went to China, that I was treated like a rock star. But my explanation goes like this. First of all, I think the Chinese are very theoretical. The Chinese like IR theory. It's really quite interesting. I've had just many conversations with Chinese students, of course, Chinese faculty members and policymakers about sort of basic realist theory, how it works, and so forth and so on. And they often challenge me. You know, in the old days when I would go over there, Chinese elites would talk about economic interdependence theory as a challenge to my realist worldview, and we would go back and forth. So I think the Chinese liked me because they liked theory. The second reason I think they liked me is I took China seriously. I said, China is going to rise to the point where it is a peer competitor of the United States. And I think the Chinese wanted to hear that. Third reason I think they liked me is I described the United States as a ruthless great power. And they would say to me, finally, an American who tells the truth about the United States. But the fourth, and I think most intriguing reason that the Chinese liked me and wanted me to come and wanted me to speak to wide audiences is that the Chinese understood that there was a lot of power in my argument, right? They understood that as they grew more powerful, there was a real danger that a security competition would set in. So it was quite a few Chinese interlocutors told me what they wanted to do was they wanted to hear my theory so they could figure out why it was wrong and how they could show that China could rise peacefully. To which I would always respond, you can't defeat my theory. China and the United States are doomed to have an intense security competition if China continues to rise peacefully. But for a long time, I would say up until about 2018, they refused to believe that, most of my interlocutors. They thought that, the deterioration of U.S.-China relations after President Trump moved into the White House was an aberration. And then when Biden came in, I think a lot of people thought we'd go back to the old days, the days of the unipolar moment. But I always told them that was not going to happen, right? There's just no way, right?
It happened.
Yeah. Well, look, from China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to dominate Asia. From China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to push the Americans out of Asia, to have their own Monroe Doctrine. So from the Chinese point of view, that makes sense. But from the American point of view, and certainly from the point of view of China's neighbors, it does not make good sense to have China as a regional hegemon. So almost all the neighbors, not all of them, but almost all the neighbors and the Americans are going to push back, and they're going to try to contain China. And that makes eminently good sense for the Americans and China's neighbors, just like it makes eminently good sense for China to try to dominate Asia. But the end result of all these actors pursuing what is the strategically rational policy is that you end up in this intense security competition where, as we discussed before, there is a serious possibility of war.
Right.
And to put out the bottom line very clearly, this is the tragedy of great power politics.
Yeah.